This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. Thomas Jefferson. If slavery be the destined sword of the hand of the destroying angel, which is to sever the ties of this Union, the same sword will cut in sunder the bonds of slavery itself. John Quincy Adams. In many ways, 1819 was a year of celebration around the world. In May, Princess Alexandrina Victoria, the future Queen of England, was born in Kensington Palace. A month later, German astronomer Johann Georg Thales discovered the Great Comet in the skies over Berlin. In November, the Museo Nacional del Prado opened in Madrid. In the United States, smack dab in the middle of the so-called era of good feelings, New York Representative James Tallmadge Jr. made a proposal that would mark the beginning of a 4-decade-long collision course with the bloodiest conflict in American history. It's the story of the Missouri Compromise on this episode of Bigfoot's Great American History Show. The first 20 Africans enslaved in North America were purchased by British colonists in Jamestown in 1619. 200 years later, 400,000 African men, women, and children had been sold to North Americans. That number paled in comparison to the 10 million Africans forcibly brought to the Caribbean and South America. Most often they entered slavery as captives of war, though some were convicts, bred for slavery, or had been kidnapped by slave hunters. Collected and processed in so-called factories along the coast, they were sold to slave ships and packed into cargo holds like commodities. As John Newton, a reformed slave ship captain and the composer of Amazing Grace, wrote, "The poor creatures thus cramped are likewise in irons for the most part, which makes it difficult for them to turn or move." Some historians estimate that as many as a quarter would die of illness or exposure before arriving in the New World. Even so, the slave trade was a lucrative business. One ship, the Hawk, earned a profit of over 7,000 pounds, or about $1.4 million 2025 dollars on a single trip in 1779. Until the second half of the 1700s, slavery was largely taken for granted up and down the American colonies. As far north as New York City, 14% of the population was enslaved in 1770. Yet the ideals of the Enlightenment and the Revolution, so eloquently expressed in the Declaration of Independence, exposed to a growing number of Americans their own hypocrisy as slaveholding freedom fighters. Beginning with the future state of Vermont in 1777, northern states began to either abolish slavery or enact gradual emancipation laws. Meanwhile, slaveholding Southerners like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson supported gradual emancipation with reservations. Washington would free his enslaved workforce upon his death. Jefferson proposed a measure in 1784 that would have prohibited slavery in the Western territories, including the future Deep South states of Alabama and Mississippi. The measure failed by one vote. All the same, following the ratification of the Constitution, many founding fathers expected that once Congress was free to abolish the international slave trade, as it did in 1808, the end of slavery itself would necessarily follow. They could not have been more wrong. With the development of water and steam-powered textile manufacturing in England, demand for cotton skyrocketed. While short-staple cotton flourished in the soil of the American South, removing seeds by hand required an immense amount of human labor. Enter Eli Whitney, who in 1793 invented an engine, or gin, that removed cotton seeds with the turning of a crank. By 1805, Southern cotton production had increased from 2 million pounds to 60 million pounds annually. Along with this increase, of course, came an increase in the demand for an enslaved workforce. In the Chesapeake region, where tobacco production had fallen off and the climate was not as suited to growing cotton, the enslaved population outgrew enslaver demand. Thus, an unforeseen and highly profitable domestic slave trade developed, with Virginians selling enslaved workers to plantations in the West. In the 5 years prior to 1819, the price of a field hand more than doubled. Meanwhile, in Haiti, the world's first and only successful slave rebellion resulted in a flood of refugees carrying stories of the insurrection to the United States. When a planned slave revolt known as Gabriel's Rebellion was uncovered in Virginia in 1800, 27 conspirators were hanged, and panic spread across the South. Any momentum for gradual emancipation came to a screeching halt, with several southern states enacting laws to ban even the voluntary freeing of enslaved workers without legislative approval. If we will keep a ferocious monster within our country, we must keep him in chains, wrote the Virginia Herald. If a dissolution of the Union must take place, let it be so. If civil war, which gentlemen so much threaten, must come, I can only say, let it come. James Tallmadge Jr. On February 13, 1819, New York Representative James Tallmadge Jr. proposed amendments which would have prohibited the importation of enslaved workers into the prospective state of Missouri and provided for the emancipation of all enslaved children born there upon their 25th birthdays. In so doing, he brought into plain sight the deepening divide between the North and the South on the slavery question. Thomas Jefferson's evolving stance on the issue reflected that of many Southerners. If slavery were to be abolished, it would need to be done by the Southern states themselves, and not by a mandate of the federal government. The unspoken reality, of course, was that the Southern states had grown too dependent on, and too fearful of, their 1.5 million enslaved workers to give them up willingly. In the years after Jefferson's death, many in the South would cease to see slavery as a regrettable evil and instead seek to justify it as a moral good. Meanwhile, Northern politicians had long been resentful of the regional imbalance in political power caused by the 3/5 clause in the Constitution, which, by counting 3 out of every 5 enslaved individuals, inflated Southern representation in Congress and the Electoral College. As it was, Virginians had won 7 of 8 presidential elections, including one they would have lost if not for the 3/5 clause. Admitting Missouri to the Union without restrictions on slavery would only add to that imbalance. The Tallmadge Amendment passed in the House along strikingly sectional lines, with Northerners voting 80-14 in favor and Southerners 64-2 against. The Senate, however, rejected the amendment, with 3 Northwestern senators joining the South in opposition. Thus, President James Monroe turned to Senate leadership and Speaker of the House Henry Clay to forge a compromise. In June, the Massachusetts state legislature agreed to grant separate statehood for the District of Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts since colonial times. Senate leadership now combined statehood for Maine, where slavery had been abolished, with statehood for Missouri, with no restrictions on slavery, thereby creating a single bill which would preserve equality between the number of free states and slave states. When Illinois Senator Jesse Thomas proposed that slavery be barred from the rest of the Louisiana Purchase north of the 3630 latitude, enough Northerners were convinced to support the compromise to allow for passage in both houses of Congress. President Monroe signed the legislation into law on March 6, 1820. Alas, this Missouri Compromise would prove little more than a bandage over a mortal wound. Missouri would shortly return a constitution to Congress that banned all free blacks from entering the state, including those who had been granted citizenship by their home states. When Northerners like John Quincy Adams pointed out that this was unconstitutional, Henry Clay helped to forge yet another compromise, wherein the Missouri legislature promised not to pass any laws in violation of the Constitution. States, of course, cannot violate the federal Constitution, promise or no promise, but the compromise got the job done. Missouri proceeded to bar all free blacks who were not citizens, sadly a practice later followed by a slew of other states both north and south. The citizenship debate would be temporarily settled in 1857 with the Dred Scott Supreme Court ruling that blacks could not be citizens at all. By 1820, Southern political leadership understood that the House would inevitably belong to the free states, whose populations were rapidly expanding. The Senate, however, might yet remain in equal balance if a slave state continued to be admitted for every free one. And so it was done for the next 30 years, until California's admission as a free state via yet another compromise largely orchestrated by one Henry Clay. The Compromise of 1850 applied the principle of popular sovereignty to New Mexico and Utah, allowing settlers there to determine the fate of slavery within their territories. 4 years later, Congress would repeal the slavery restrictions of the Missouri Compromise in favor of popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska. Thus was the price paid to keep the Union in balance. Alas, by then, the Union lay balanced on the edge of a sword. Until next time, this is Bigfoot saying so long and save me a seat at your next campfire.